Good morning and welcome back to Ephesians with Josh. I'm Josh, and this week we're looking at Ephesians 6 verses 1 to 9, at what Paul has to say about submission in the context of a parent-child relationship and a master-slave relationship. Now I'll come to the parent-child one first, and then we'll look at the master-slave one. So to start off, in verse 2 of chapter 6, Paul provides us with a quote from Exodus. He shows us that he's not just making this stuff up. He's quoting the very words of God, mentioning one of the 10 Commandments, which says, "Honor your father and mother." Now, I think these days, children have an overall lower respect for their parents. I'm not saying that all children do, but I've just noticed that there is an overall lower respect for parents from children. And I think it's because of this age of online influence, celebrities and other role models, which are causing children to be pulled away from honouring their parents. I'm not saying it's bad to look up to someone who isn't your parents. For example, looking up to God is obviously more important. But God gives us parents to look after us and to teach us as we grow. So we need to respect them and honour them, because that's who God's given us. But as with both other examples of submission that Paul writes about, the instruction goes both ways. Parents need to look after their children just as much as the children need to take the parents looking after them and submit to that. God put them there as parents and gave them the job of raising them up in a godly way, not being cruel to them or completely disregarding their growth in knowledge of the Bible. Now, I'm not saying that most parents are cruel, but I do think that there's always room for improvement from both parents and children to do better at following what this passage says. And it's even more critical when we realize that the relationship here is supposed to reflect the relationship between God and his children. Now we get to the next part of the passage, and this is where it gets a bit more controversial, because at first glance it seems like Paul is okay with slavery. Now, I don't want to get into all the details, but I do want to say that Paul is not condoning slavery at all. What he's instead doing is speaking into the culture of the time, because at that time, slavery was not uncommon. The argument here isn't whether slavery is right or wrong, because it's wrong. It's a matter of, while slavery is wrong, it's also a huge part of the culture, and it's therefore hard to completely condemn and remove. And so Paul's saying that because of this situation, in the relationship between a master and slave, this is what it should look like. There must be mutual respect for one another. The slave needs to obey and submit to the master, and the master is to look after the slave, not threaten them or treat them poorly. Paul's kind of saying, look, what you're doing here isn't okay, but at least if you're going to do it this way. Paul goes on to remind us that even though there are slaves and masters, God is the master of all of them. And as a master, God is the perfect role model of how to act in any relationship, which is being loving and caring for the other members of that relationship. It's hard to apply the bit about slaves to today's context, because slavery isn't as commonplace as it was then, even though it's still an issue today. But I think that it's similar to the previous two parts in the sense that in a relationship between husband and wife, parent and child, master and slave, employer and employees, there must always be submission between them. And submission isn't a bad thing. It's not about hierarchy or status. It's about love and care for one another. Even Jesus submits to the Father. So my call for this week is to look at relationships with others and think, how can this relationship be more godly?